Dust rose behind the caravan as the final outline of familiar land disappeared into the horizon, and the chosen walked forward without certainty, without comfort, and without explanation. Across the ancient roads of Mesopotamia, through the dry river valleys between Ur and Canaan, suffering appeared before destiny almost every single time. The pattern repeated itself through deserts, prisons, caves, foreign kingdoms, mountains, exile routes, and forgotten wilderness regions. Long before crowns, revelation, leadership, or covenant fulfillment arrived, suffering moved first. Abraham crossed harsh terrain under an open sky with no city to inherit and no map guaranteeing survival. Joseph descended from favored son to slave caravan prisoner beneath the burning trade roads stretching toward Egypt. Moses vanished into Midian for decades, beyond the eastern wilderness after fleeing royal power and political collapse. David moved between caves in Judah while armies hunted him through rocky valleys south of Jerusalem. Elijah hid beside isolated streams east of the Jordan during drought and fear. Jeremiah walked through the destruction of Jerusalem while empires crushed nations around him. Ezekiel received visions among captives beside foreign rivers in Babylon. Daniel endured exile beneath imperial authority hundreds of miles away from his homeland. John received revelation while isolated on Patmos, surrounded by sea and distance. The suffering never arrived accidentally. It appeared with rhythm, sequence, and terrifying consistency. Before elevation came reduction. Before influence came isolation. Before spiritual authority came displacement. The chosen were rarely prepared in comfort, because comfort preserved attachment to the familiar world they were about to leave behind. Geography itself became part of the process. The biblical narrative unfolded through migration routes, military roads, wilderness regions, river crossings, and collapsing cities. The chosen were separated from stability because stability preserved old identity. Ancient wilderness routes were not merely empty places between destinations. They became environments where identity was dismantled and rebuilt. The Sinai Peninsula became more than desert terrain after the Exodus. It became a prolonged corridor of transformation, where an enslaved people slowly lost the mentality of Egypt while moving toward a land they could barely imagine. Their suffering did not simply punish them, it revealed them. Hunger exposed fear. Delay exposed rebellion. Isolation exposed dependency. Every mile through barren land stripped illusions away. The chosen often suffered because they carried assignments larger than personal comfort, and large assignments required the destruction of smaller ambitions. Egypt had to leave Israel before Israel could enter Canaan. That process took years beneath heat, silence, uncertainty, and constant movement. The hidden reason suffering followed the chosen was because suffering separated them from the world they could not carry into the future. Abraham could not become Abraham while remaining Abram in the security of his birthplace. Joseph could not preserve his old innocence while governing famine-struck empires. Moses could not remain divided between Hebrew suffering and Egyptian privilege. The chosen were repeatedly forced into environments where previous identities collapsed under pressure. Ancient roads became instruments of transformation. Wilderness became preparation. Delay became purification. Silence became revelation. The biblical world was filled with empires, trade routes, wars, famines, migrations, and political instability. Yet within all of that movement, the chosen were often removed from the center of visible power before being returned to it later, with entirely different vision. Joseph entered Egypt as a prisoner and eventually stood beside Pharaoh. Moses fled Egypt as a fugitive and returned decades later, confronting imperial authority directly. David hid among wilderness strongholds before entering Jerusalem as king. Jesus spent time in the wilderness before public ministry began across Galilee and Judea. The pattern was too consistent to ignore. Suffering interrupted identity before destiny unfolded publicly. Ancient suffering also revealed endurance that prosperity could never expose. In Scripture, those entrusted with movement, covenant, warning, revelation, or leadership almost always passed through prolonged seasons where external circumstances contradicted future purpose. Noah built while surrounded by disbelief. Abraham wandered while promised descendants beyond number. Joseph interpreted dreams while imprisoned underground. Moses carried leadership while exhausted beneath endless complaints. Elijah fled while believing he stood alone. Jeremiah preached while cities collapsed around him. Paul crossed dangerous maritime routes while imprisoned, beaten and hunted. Their suffering forced them to confront whether purpose depended upon circumstances or conviction. The chosen suffered because their future assignments required stability that could survive instability. Ancient deserts taught endurance because deserts removed distraction. There were no crowded cities in the Sinai wilderness, no abundance, no certainty of tomorrow, no permanent structures. Only movement remained, only dependence remained, only direction remained. Scripture repeatedly placed chosen figures in transitional spaces because transition exposed the truth hidden beneath external identity. In stable environments, people often confuse routine with purpose. In unstable environments, purpose becomes survival itself. The hidden reason suffering appeared so consistently among the chosen was because suffering stripped away false foundations before responsibility arrived. A leader still dependent upon comfort could not endure famine, war, exile, betrayal, or national collapse. The chosen often carried responsibilities directly connected to unstable historical periods. Joseph preserved nations during famine. Moses guided migration through wilderness. Esther navigated imperial politics during genocide threats. Nehemiah rebuilt walls after exile devastation. Paul carried the gospel across hostile territories, connected by Roman roads stretching from Jerusalem toward Europe. Their assignments required resilience greater than personal emotion. Suffering built that resilience long before public responsibility appeared. The biblical landscape itself reflected this process. Mountains symbolized encounter, deserts symbolized transformation, rivers symbolized transition, exile symbolized displacement, and wilderness symbolized preparation. Geography became narrative structure. The chosen moved physically because internal transformation often followed physical displacement. Abram left Ur-Issi, Jacob fled toward Haran, Joseph descended into Egypt, Israel crossed the Red Sea, Elijah traveled into the wilderness, Judah entered Babylonian exile. Jesus traveled through Galilee, Samaria, Judea, and surrounding regions. Paul crossed provinces, coastlines, islands, and imperial territories. Movement constantly accompanied suffering because suffering disconnected the chosen from permanence. Permanence often creates illusion. Wilderness destroys illusion quickly. Hunger reveals dependency. Isolation reveals fear. Delay reveals impatience. Silence reveals insecurity. Pressure reveals loyalty. Scripture repeatedly showed that suffering was not random chaos surrounding chosen people. It was often the environment where identity was clarified. The future could not be entrusted to people still controlled by the present. Moses spent 40 years inside Egyptian structures and 40 more inside Midian before returning to confront Pharaoh. That timeline mattered. Egypt taught education, administration, language, and power. Midian taught silence, obscurity, endurance, and distance from self-importance. Only after both phases did Moses stand ready to lead a nation through wilderness. The hidden reason suffering accompanied the chosen was because calling required reconstruction at the deepest level of identity. The process could not happen quickly. Time itself became part of the transformation. Decades passed between promise and fulfillment throughout Scripture. Abraham waited, Joseph waited, Moses waited, David waited, Israel waited, the prophets waited, the disciples waited. Delay intensified suffering because delay forced endurance without visible evidence. Yet delay also prevented premature elevation. A crown arriving before transformation could destroy the one wearing it. Ancient kingdoms collapsed repeatedly because rulers possessed authority without wisdom, ambition without discipline, and power without restraint. Scripture consistently portrayed suffering as a separating force. It separated appearance from substance. It separated emotion from conviction. It separated desire from readiness. The chosen often lost public security before gaining spiritual clarity. Job lost wealth, family, status, and stability before confronting reality, stripped of every visible support system. His suffering exposed the fragile foundations beneath earthly certainty. Exile narratives carried the same pattern on a national scale. Israel lost land, temple access, political independence and security under Babylonian conquest. Yet exile also produced reflection, preservation of identity, and deeper understanding of covenant history. Suffering became the furnace where memory survived destruction. The chosen suffered because suffering revealed what could survive collapse. Throughout biblical history, empires rose and fell across the Near East. Assyria expanded violently. Babylon conquered Jerusalem. Persia absorbed territories. Greece spread Hellenistic influence. Rome dominated roads, trade, taxation, and military power. Amid those shifting systems, the chosen were repeatedly refined through instability rather than protected from it. Scripture never promised uninterrupted comfort to those carrying responsibility. Instead, it repeatedly showed suffering preceding expansion, revelation, and influence. The hidden reason suffering followed the chosen was because suffering forced dependence upon what could not be destroyed by external collapse. Cities burned, kingdoms fell, armies advanced, famines spread, roads filled with refugees, yet the narrative continued moving forward through people refined by pressure rather than protected from it. Ancient suffering became preparation for enduring historical turbulence. The chosen were shaped in wilderness because wilderness taught survival without visible certainty. They were shaped in exile because exile taught identity without homeland. They were shaped through betrayal because betrayal taught discernment. They were shaped through delay because delay taught endurance. The process was brutal, slow, and often misunderstood while unfolding, yet Scripture consistently revealed the same patterns stretching across generations, territories, and centuries. Suffering arrived before responsibility because responsibility required transformation deeper than comfort could ever produce. Night settled over the valleys of Judea, while scattered fires flickered beside temporary camps, and generations of the chosen continued moving through history, carrying burdens that often seemed heavier than the promise itself. Across Scripture, suffering rarely appeared as a single isolated event. It unfolded as a prolonged environment surrounding transition periods, political collapse, migration, betrayal, famine, conquest, and spiritual preparation. The chosen suffered because they were repeatedly positioned at the intersection between old worlds ending and new worlds beginning. That position carried enormous pressure. Abraham arrived in Canaan during unstable tribal eras where survival depended upon movement, negotiation, livestock, and seasonal conditions. Joseph governed Egypt during famine that threatened entire populations across the region. Moses led displaced tribes through one of the harshest wilderness corridors in the ancient world. David inherited a fractured kingdom surrounded by enemies and internal division. Jeremiah witnessed the final destruction of Jerusalem before Babylonian exile. The disciples carried the message of Christ through territories controlled by Rome, where roads connected empires but also accelerated persecution, surveillance, and political control. The chosen were often placed directly inside historical turbulence because their role was connected to transition itself. They suffered because they were required to walk through collapse without becoming part of the collapse. Ancient history reveals how fragile civilizations truly were. Harvest failure could destroy economies, military invasions could erase cities, trade route disruption could produce starvation, drought could trigger migration, disease could devastate populations. Within that unstable world, the chosen were rarely sheltered from suffering. Instead, they were shaped inside it. The hidden reason suffering followed them was because suffering trained them to carry responsibility inside unstable environments. Comfort could not produce that strength. Predictability could not produce that endurance. The wilderness became necessary because wilderness removed dependency upon visible stability. Moses learned leadership not inside Pharaoh's palace, but while surviving the harsh landscapes east of Egypt. David learned endurance, not while seated on a throne, but while moving through caves, hills, and wilderness strongholds south of Jerusalem. Paul learned perseverance not during peaceful years, but while traveling dangerous Roman roads. enduring imprisonment, shipwrecks, beatings, and constant uncertainty. Their suffering formed internal stability stronger than external circumstances. Scripture repeatedly showed that the chosen were not selected because they were naturally powerful. Many were weak, isolated, rejected, fearful, or unknown. Gideon hid from oppression. Jeremiah resisted his own calling. Jonah fled in the opposite direction. Peter collapsed under fear before later standing publicly with courage. Their suffering exposed human limitation first. Only after limitation became undeniable did transformation begin unfolding clearly. The chosen suffered because suffering dismantled self-reliance. Ancient cultures admired military strength, political power, wealth, and public status. Scripture repeatedly redirected attention toward endurance, faithfulness, humility, and obedience developed under pressure. The process created individuals capable of surviving historical storms without losing direction. Egypt serves as one of the clearest examples of this hidden pattern. Joseph entered Egypt, chained beside slave traders. Years later, he governed during regional famine. Yet between those moments came betrayal, false accusation, imprisonment, obscurity, and delay. His suffering isolated him from the illusions of his youth. The arrogant confidence of the young dreamer disappeared inside prison walls. By the time authority arrived, Joseph possessed discipline forged through humiliation and patience forged through waiting. The chosen suffered because premature elevation without transformation would have corrupted their purpose. Scripture consistently delayed fulfillment until internal reconstruction had occurred. David provides another example stretching across the geography of ancient Israel. After being anointed, he did not immediately enter stable kingship. Instead, he moved through forests, caves, deserts, and enemy territories while pursued by Saul. The future king survived among isolated wilderness regions such as Adullam and En-Gedi. These were not symbolic places detached from reality. They were harsh environments shaped by cliffs, caves, dry terrain, and political instability. David learned survival before leadership. He learned restraint before authority. Multiple opportunities emerged where he could have seized power violently, yet suffering forced him to confront the difference between ambition and readiness. The hidden reason the chosen suffered was because suffering revealed whether they desired power for themselves or responsibility for others. The biblical narrative repeatedly distinguished between those transformed by suffering and those destroyed by ambition. Saul collapsed under insecurity. Pharaoh hardened under pressure. Nebuchadnezzar exalted himself until humiliation overtook him. Judas pursued personal expectation rather than transformation. By contrast, many of the chosen emerged from suffering with greater clarity, restraint, and endurance. The process remained painful because suffering confronted identity directly. Ancient wilderness journeys stripped people of distraction. There were no monuments in the desert, no applause, no certainty of provision beyond each day. Survival depended upon movement and trust. Israel's 40 years in the wilderness revealed how deeply Egypt still existed within them psychologically, long after physical escape. They left slavery geographically before slavery left them internally. The suffering of the wilderness exposed fear, rebellion, nostalgia, impatience, and dependency upon visible systems. Yet it also formed a generation capable of eventually entering new territory. Suffering separated them from the mentality of captivity. That hidden separation process appears repeatedly across Scripture. The chosen were removed from environments shaping old identity before stepping into future responsibility. Abraham left his homeland. Joseph left his family. Moses left Egypt. Ruth left Moab. Esther lost ordinary anonymity. Daniel lost Jerusalem. Paul lost former status among religious authorities. Their suffering carried displacement because displacement interrupted attachment to familiar structures. The chosen often walked through loneliness because loneliness exposed what still controlled them internally. Scripture never romanticized that loneliness. Elijah collapsed beneath exhaustion in the wilderness. Jeremiah wept over destruction. David cried inside isolation. Jesus experienced abandonment in Gethsemane. Paul described hardship, danger, and pressure repeatedly throughout his journeys. The suffering remained real, physical, emotional, historical, and severe. Yet through that suffering, something emerged that prosperity alone could never create. Endurance became identity. Clarity became stronger than emotion. Direction survived uncertainty. Ancient roads became symbols of this movement. Trade routes crossing the Near East connected nations, armies, merchants, pilgrims, refugees, and exiles. Along those same roads traveled prophets, prisoners, fugitives, apostles, and displaced families. Scripture unfolded through movement because the chosen were rarely allowed permanent comfort. Movement forced dependence upon direction rather than location. Abraham wandered, Israel journeyed, exiles returned, apostles traveled. The chosen suffered because they were part of unfolding historical movement larger than individual stability. Their lives became connected to transitions, reshaping nations and generations. Even Jesus entered public ministry following wilderness isolation. Before Galilean crowds gathered, before miracles spread across Judea, before Jerusalem became the center of final confrontation, there was wilderness. 40 days separated public ministry from ordinary preparation. That pattern echoed generations before him. Solitude preceded mission. Pressure preceded clarity. The hidden reason suffering followed the chosen was because suffering created separation between external identity and internal reality. Public recognition could not sustain a person whose foundation remained fragile. Wilderness exposed fragility completely. In Scripture, deserts were not merely empty land. They became environments where false certainty died. Hunger, silence, heat, distance, and vulnerability forced confrontation with reality. Israel wandered there. Elijah fled there. John the Baptist preached there. Jesus fasted there. The desert represented stripping away illusion until only dependence, direction, and identity remained. The chosen suffered because suffering removed distractions, hiding deeper weaknesses. Throughout biblical history, suffering also preserved humility. Leaders shaped entirely through success often became dangerous. Scripture documented repeated collapses caused by pride, greed, fear, or self-exaltation. Suffering interrupted that pattern by forcing confrontation with weakness. Paul described a persistent affliction preventing self-exaltation despite extraordinary revelation. Moses remained marked by years of obscurity before leadership emerged. David remembered wilderness years even after kingship arrived. Their suffering created memory. That memory preserved humility during influence. The chosen suffered because suffering prevented them from forgetting human limitation. Historical perspective reveals another hidden layer behind this pattern. Many chosen figures carried messages or responsibilities opposing dominant systems around them. Prophets confronted kings. Apostles challenged religious corruption. Moses confronted empire. Elijah confronted idolatry. Jeremiah warned of destruction nobody wished to hear. The chosen suffered partly because truth often collided with power. Ancient empires demanded conformity, loyalty, and silence. Those carrying warnings, revelation, or covenant responsibility frequently became isolated because their existence threatened established structures. Suffering followed them because standing apart from dominant systems produced rejection naturally. Yet Scripture repeatedly portrayed this rejection as part of preparation rather than proof of abandonment. The chosen were refined through opposition until their identity no longer depended upon acceptance. Their direction survived isolation because suffering forced deeper conviction. Through deserts, prisons, exile routes, collapsing cities, hostile territories, and years of waiting, the same hidden reality continued unfolding across generations. Suffering shaped people capable of carrying responsibility beyond comfort, beyond applause, beyond stability, and beyond fear. The chosen suffered because suffering transformed fragile identity into enduring purpose before history demanded everything from them. Rain clouds gathered above the ruined stones of Jerusalem, while smoke drifted upward from shattered gates, and the final generations of the biblical narrative carried forward the same ancient pattern that had marked the chosen from the very beginning. Suffering never disappeared from the story, because the story itself unfolded across centuries of conflict, migration, empire, exile, occupation, and spiritual transition. The hidden reason the chosen always suffered was not because suffering itself was the goal, but because history repeatedly demanded people capable of carrying truth through collapse without surrendering to despair. Scripture revealed this pattern through geography, chronology, and movement across the ancient world. From the river systems of Mesopotamia to the deserts of Sinai, from the mountains of Judea to the roads of the Roman Empire, the chosen moved through environments that stripped away illusion and forced confrontation with reality. The process was never comfortable because comfort preserved attachment to temporary things. The chosen suffered because their lives were repeatedly redirected toward purposes larger than personal survival. In the final centuries before the arrival of Christ, the land of Israel itself became a crossroads of pressure and domination. Babylon had destroyed Jerusalem. Persia later allowed return and rebuilding. Greece spread Hellenistic culture across the eastern Mediterranean. Rome eventually imposed military authority over the region through taxation, occupation, and political control. Every generation inherited instability from the previous one. Within that historical pressure, suffering became deeply connected to preservation of identity. The chosen suffered because they carried continuity during periods designed to erase continuity. Daniel survived inside Babylonian courts without surrendering his identity. Ezra restored the reading of the law after exile. Nehemiah rebuilt Jerusalem's walls while surrounded by hostility and political resistance. The suffering surrounding them was historical, not symbolic. Armies existed, threats existed, poverty existed, ruins existed. Yet within those harsh conditions, endurance preserved memory and covenant across generations. By the time Roman authority dominated Judea, the region had become tense with expectation, fear, taxation, political violence, and social division. Roads built by Rome connected provinces, stretching from Britain toward the Near East, allowing military movement, commerce, and communication across enormous distances. Those same roads later carried the apostles outward from Jerusalem into Asia Minor, Greece, and eventually Rome itself. The chosen once again suffered while moving through historical transition. The disciples carried their message through regions where public allegiance to another kingdom threatened existing power structures. Imprisonment, persecution, rejection, and martyrdom followed because the world surrounding them resisted transformation. Yet suffering also accelerated movement. Persecution scattered believers outward from Jerusalem into surrounding territories. Exile spread influence further than comfort ever would have allowed. The hidden reason suffering followed the chosen was because suffering often became the force pushing them beyond limitation, beyond familiarity, and beyond isolation into larger historical impact. Scripture consistently showed movement emerging from pressure. Abraham moved because of calling. Jacob moved because of famine. Moses moved because of exile and return. Israel moved because of liberation. Ruth moved because of loss. The apostles moved because of persecution. The chosen suffered because suffering disrupted permanence and forced transition into the next stage of unfolding history. Even the structure of biblical revelation reflected this movement. Covenants expanded across generations, kingdoms rose and collapsed, prophets warned before destruction arrived, exiles returned and rebuilt. The narrative advanced through disruption. Stability was temporary. Movement remained constant. The chosen learned to survive within that movement because their purpose depended upon adaptability rooted in conviction rather than circumstance. This is why Scripture repeatedly placed the chosen in wilderness environments before public assignment intensified. Wilderness removed dependency upon systems destined to collapse anyway. A person formed entirely by comfort would collapse when comfort disappeared. A person formed by suffering could endure instability without losing direction. Joseph survived prison before surviving power. Moses survived obscurity before surviving leadership pressure. David survived wilderness before surviving kingship. Paul survived persecution before surviving influence across the Roman world. Their suffering prepared them for environments where ordinary stability no longer existed. Ancient suffering also produced vision beyond immediate circumstances. People surrounded entirely by prosperity often focus only on preservation of the present moment. Those shaped through suffering learn to look further ahead, because survival itself requires perspective larger than temporary emotion. Noah built toward a future nobody else could see. Abraham moved toward land he did not yet possess. Moses guided people toward territory still beyond the horizon. Jeremiah warned about destruction before it arrived, and spoke about restoration before it became visible. The chosen suffered because suffering forced them to live according to conviction rather than visible certainty. Their lives became anchored to direction rather than immediate comfort. The process repeatedly separated them from dependence upon public approval. Prophets were ignored. Apostles were persecuted. David was hunted. Elijah believed himself abandoned. Jeremiah was rejected by his own people. Jesus himself was misunderstood, opposed, betrayed, and crucified under Roman authority outside Jerusalem's walls. The suffering surrounding the chosen reached its clearest expression at Golgotha, where the collision between earthly power and divine purpose unfolded publicly before the city. Rome displayed execution as intimidation. Crowds gathered beneath political fear and spiritual confusion. Yet even there, Scripture continued revealing the same pattern present from Genesis onward: suffering preceding transformation, suffering preceding victory, suffering preceding expansion. After the resurrection, movement accelerated outward rapidly. Jerusalem became the starting point rather than the end point. Apostles crossed provinces and seas carrying the message through Antioch, Ephesus, Corinth, Philippi, Athens, Malta, and Rome. Many died violently, many endured imprisonment, many disappeared into hostile territories carrying conviction stronger than fear. Their suffering became part of the expansion itself. The hidden reason the chosen suffered was because suffering disconnected them from attachment to temporary security and anchored them instead to enduring purpose. Rome eventually weakened. Empires shifted again. Cities changed hands again. Yet the narrative survived beyond the structures surrounding it. Scripture consistently portrayed suffering as temporary compared to the endurance created through it. The chosen were refined by wilderness because wilderness prepared them for responsibility. They were refined by exile because exile preserved identity beyond homeland. They were refined by rejection because rejection separated conviction from popularity. They were refined by delay because delay strengthened endurance. Through every generation, the same underlying reality remained visible beneath the movement of history. Suffering exposed whether identity depended upon circumstances or truth. Ancient geography reinforced this reality constantly. Deserts represented dependence. Mountains represented encounter. Rivers represented transition. Exile represented displacement. Cities represented both civilization and corruption. Roads represented movement into the unknown. Scripture unfolded through these locations because the chosen themselves were always moving through transformation. The hidden reason suffering followed them was because transformation demanded separation from illusions that comfort protected. Pressure revealed what prosperity often concealed. Silence revealed what noise distracted from. Delay revealed what impatience tried to escape. The chosen suffered because suffering dismantled everything incapable of surviving the weight of their future responsibility. By the end of the biblical narrative, the pattern had become unmistakable across centuries of history. Abraham leaving Ur, Joseph entering Egypt, Moses crossing Sinai, David hiding in caves, Israel entering exile, Daniel surviving Babylon, the disciples spreading outward under Roman persecution, and John receiving revelation on Patmos, all reflected the same progression unfolding through different generations and landscapes. The chosen were repeatedly separated, refined, displaced, tested, isolated, delayed, and pressured before carrying influence beyond themselves. Their suffering was never meaningless chaos disconnected from history. It became the environment where endurance replaced illusion, where identity survived collapse, and where purpose emerged stronger than fear. Across deserts, kingdoms, prisons, storms, exile routes, mountains, ruins, and ancient roads stretching through the biblical world, the hidden reason the chosen always suffered became increasingly clear. Suffering prepared them to carry lasting purpose through unstable history without losing direction, without surrendering identity, and without collapsing beneath the weight of the calling placed upon them.